Closed captioning for Justice and Law Weekly is provided in part by the Clifford Law Offices in support of quality public television for the Chicago area.
Welcome to the Chicago Bar Association's Justice and Law Weekly. I'm Aurora Balastriaco, president of the Chicago Bar Association. The so-called justice gap between the legal needs of low-income people and the capacity of the civil legal assistance system to meet those needs is threatening equal access to justice. Recent studies have shown that the U.S. ranks 21st on access to justice for disadvantaged groups and 52nd in the world in terms of access to legal assistance. Less than 20% of poor Americans' legal needs are being met. As demand has been rising, the combined funding for legal aid programs from federal, state, local, and all other sources has dropped from $960 million in 2010 to $878 million in 2012. Here to discuss this critical issue with me are Diane C. White, Executive Director of LAF, formerly the Legal Assistance Foundation of Metropolitan Chicago. LAF works to provide high-quality civil legal services to low-income and disadvantaged people and communities. Diana was the recipient of a 2000 Equal Justice Award for her extraordinary legal work in support of LAF's complex litigation and cases on appeal. I also welcome John G. Levy, Chair of the Board of Directors of the Legal Services Corporation. The mission of the LSC is reflected in the words engraved above the entrance to the United States Supreme Court: equal justice under law. Mr. Levy was appointed by President Barack Obama on August 6, 2009, and he was confirmed by the U.S. Senate in 2010. He was subsequently elected chairman of the LSC board by his peers in 2010. Mr. Levy is a partner in the Chicago office of Sidley Austin, LLP. Ms. White, Chairman Levy, welcome to the show, and really thank you for coming here and joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Great, thanks. Chairman Levy, what is the Legal Services Corporation?
Well, the Legal Services Corporation was established by Congress in 1974, actually as the last act of the Nixon administration, to provide federal funding, essentially a federal foundation to support legal assistance clinics in the 50 states. So we have 134 programs today that are supported in the 50 states. They then have satellite offices as well. There are nearly 900 such offices around the country. And this is civil legal assistance, not criminal, civil legal assistance for people who are living, those who receive the funds from the Legal Services Corporation are living at or below 125% of the federal poverty guideline.
Now, Mr. Levy, is the funding directly just from the federal government, or do you also get funding from other sources?
Well, we give a grant that we receive. We supervise the federal grant. Our grantees do receive monies, which you actually talked about in your intro there a second ago, from other sources, from state, local governments, from IALTA, interest on lawyer trust accounts. Of course, in the recent period here with low interest rates, those funds have diminished.
Right. Now,
So for LAF, for example, the LSC grant that we get is about half of our budget.
right.
We're a $14 million a year operation. About $7 million comes from LSC, and the rest comes from other federal and state and local government grants, foundations, law firms, individual lawyers, and private donors who may not be lawyers at all.
Right. Now, Ms. White, let's go to you. You indicated that you are a recipient of the grant from LSC. Now, what are the legal services that you provide?
We provide service in the full range of poverty law issues, non-criminal cases, But the areas of highest demand for us are family law, which almost always has domestic violence lurking in it somewhere. Housing, which for us is public housing and subsidized housing, not market rate or private housing. Consumer, which includes foreclosure defense and bankruptcy, as well as the consumer scams that just pop up like mushrooms after a rainstorm for poor people, and public benefits, which are all the systems there are in place to keep people from just starving to death or becoming homeless.
Right, right, right. What is the number of recipients of legal services that you
In a
provide
typical
services
year,
to?
we will handle 20,000 cases, and those will involve families and other people, so that we say we affect the lives of 60,000 people
Right.
a year.
And that's a pretty substantial number.
It is, except that there are 1.5 million poor people in the county who qualify for our services, and we know that we're not meeting anything like the
Well,
full
that's because
magnitude of the need.
You have a priority system for deciding who, for example, is going to receive assistance, and then if you don't meet the priority, you're going to be turned away or put
Well,
to-
that's true. I mean, there are certain things we don't do. We try not to duplicate what other legal aid organizations around town are already doing. Everybody's trying to be as strategic as we can.
Right.
But we have a system now where people who want help from LAF call a telephone number, and we have 15 people in a room taking those calls, and that they take as many as they can finish in a day. We don't carry calls over from one day to the next. And that line is typically closed down by 10 or 10:30 in the morning. And
Yeah,
people get a
wow.
message saying, you know, the queue is full, call back tomorrow, try earlier in the morning. We open at 8 o'clock in the morning.
Right.
But the demand is just huge.
Right.
I mean, in your intro, you talked about what's happened to funding, but the economic crisis of the last 4 or 5 years has meant half again as many poor people in the county, and the problems they encounter are much more complicated than they used to be. Houses in foreclosure, tenants in foreclosed buildings. The state has cut so many essential social services that you get just really bizarre things going on in DCFS.
Right.
CPS, we all know the problems that are going on there. So it's really a perfect storm. I mean, the problems are worse and the money is less.
I would say nationally, the Legal Services Corporation entities help approximately 2 million people, over 2 million people. But the fact is that our studies have shown that at least 50% of the folks who would be eligible to receive help are not receiving it, and most of the state studies are closer to the 80% are not being helped. In fact, the appropriation from the federal government to legal services, which I think currently we're operating at 350 million. That is, in inflation-adjusted dollars, an all-time low, even as the number of folks who are eligible is probably at an all-time high. The estimates are that somewhere in the neighborhood of 61 million people qualify for civil legal assistance across the country, nearly 20% of the population.
Right, right. Now, we had talked about, the number of people who need legal assistance are unmet, and it's staggering. It keeps going up, and it's going to keep going up just because of the economy. And then on your budget, you've got the budget just shrinking.
Yes.
And the 60 million that you had mentioned that are probably not served at this point, is it because they're just not familiar with the legal system? We understand that we don't have enough money for capacity to address all of them, but is it because they have not quite reached out, or they didn't know about the services, or they just don't qualify under the standard that we have? They're not really under the poverty level, but they can't afford a lawyer?
I think most of the unmet need just to go back to how LAF screens in clients, is people who call after the queue is closed.
Yeah.
I think people understand that they've got a legal problem, or they've got a problem they don't know what to do with, and they think they need a lawyer. I think they try us, and they try every other avenue they can think of, and the phone lines just get jammed. And we're setting appointments 2 and 3 weeks out. If you set them much further out than that, then people they forget to come, or something intervenes and they can't come. Our no-show rate is virtually non-existent now.
Right.
But we're turning away, I think John is right, probably 80% of the people who call. Sometimes they call, they want help with a criminal case. Well, we don't do a criminal case. Or they want information, and we can provide it. Or it's a problem they can handle themselves, and we tell them where to go and what to do and how to handle it. But we're still turning away people who need the ongoing services of a lawyer, not just a piece of advice or a brochure, and are not able to get it.
Right, right. Now, yours is more a direct legal service,
Yes,
correct?
yes.
Now, Mr. Levy, with the LSC, is it a direct legal service, or it's the funding that
We're
you
like a
provide
federal
mostly?
foundation
Okay.
supporting legal services. I should say that Diana runs one of the best programs in the United States. But here she is struggling
Yeah.
under these funding constraints. And if you looked at what's happened nationally as a result of the cuts and the reduction in money, our programs across that are supported by legal services have had to reduce their staffs by something like 15% into the teeth of this. And that's really very tough on everyone. Now, you know, years ago, we could have designed other systems. Other countries, as you referred to in your intro there, handle civil legal assistance in other ways. But we decided years ago that we would, through either clinics, which we have to have fully operating clinics, a combination of that and pro bono, that is the donated services of lawyers who are willing to give of themselves, provide some of their time, that we would somehow stitch that together and meet the legal needs of low-income folks. Unfortunately, the great aspiration and hope that we all have that we're going to be a country that provides equal access to justice, it's just not happening. And we need to be honest with ourselves, and in some respects as a profession. I have so many friends in the profession who actually provide pro bono services, and they themselves are not even fully aware of the gravity of the circumstance. So right now, in a sense, what you're helping us do today is explain the gravity of the circumstance, which I think is an eye-opener for many people.
Right. And I think the problem may even get worse if the funding keeps getting cut.
Yes.
And there's no way to stop that. But my question also is, you have this growing need of possible representation. Do you have a lot of lawyers willing to come out and volunteer, you know, pro bono? Or is it such that you have volunteers, but you really don't have the capacity to train them because you're maxed out?
It's a little of both.
Yeah.
We have a number of volunteers. We have a dedicated person she is an attorney herself, and her whole job is to provide training and support to the volunteer attorneys who take cases. And we think to be successful in attracting volunteers, we've got to have an array of pro bono opportunities for them. It's got to be like a smorgasbord almost. And there are people, we have some retired attorneys who come to our office and work 3 days a week. And we had one who was just honored by the ABA at their national meeting here in Chicago, who's given us 7,000 hours over the last 4 or 5 years after retiring as an attorney in an insurance defense firm. And Howard is one of the most reliable, wonderful people in the office. We have signature projects. So we'll teach a firm how to handle, say, a special ed case, and they'll have enough people who are interested in doing that that it'll become a self-sustaining project, and then we just go back in and refresh people from time to time and provide support. We have clinics where volunteer attorneys just come in on a Saturday morning and give whatever advice they can give to people who are just walk-ins. And sometimes the problems are pretty easy. How do I do a name change? How do I get a state ID? Sometimes they're awful. And then you have to take them back to LAF or to the lawyer's firm and say, this really requires ongoing work. Can you help us with it?
Right.
I think the truth is that the need is so enormous, the unmet need so enormous, that even with the best work that Diane is doing, we have to dramatically increase, and probably it's both a combination of the funding and the pro bono talent, and then match it, better match it, so that because folks out there in law practice or in corporations, they may occasionally take a case. They aren't thinking about the mismatch of the kinds of things that are not being met, and the case that happened to come in with a little bit of publicity and what have you. There isn't a coordination of that to say, here's the pro bono, the talent that exists. And even as to that talent, we have to figure out how to increase that pool dramatically, and then take that talent and match it better to what Diana's office is seeing all the time. And incidentally, those buckets of cases that her office handles, they don't change that much. They just go up in number in an economic time, but the buckets stay the same.
Right.
Well,
so I've said a lot there, and I didn't mean...
Yeah.
John is hitting on two important points. One is the justice gap for us is not, you know, the fancy, sexy international law case. It's poor people in our community who are going under for the third time. And people need to understand that and be more aware of it. Then what they do with that information is a distinct other question. The other thing that I think any successful effort to enlist private attorneys to help with this work requires is a healthy, vital legal aid substructure. Because we're the ones who, the areas of law we practice in are really complicated. And there's nothing easy about public housing law or immigration law or public benefits law. So we have the basic information. We can package it in ways that make it digestible and intelligible to somebody who's not going to turn it into their life's work. We also are the best, and it's takes a long time to get this skill, learn it, at interviewing clients and screening the cases. We get clients every day who come in, and what they have is a giant brown shopping bag full of all the important papers in their lives. And they just want to dump this out on the table. And somewhere in there are all the rent receipts you need or the notices from public aid. But you've got to be able to screen the cases. There are people who come to us who have awful situations about which we can do nothing. The statute of limitations has run, and there's nothing more deadly than to give a case like that to a pro bono attorney, because not only will they not be able to help, but it will sour them on the efficacy of pro bono. So all this screening and training, and then the last thing we do with every case we send out of our office is, here is the direct dial number of somebody at LAF you can call whenever something strange happens. We have language access issues. I mean, half our staff is bilingual in English and Spanish, but we have probably 50 or 60 other languages that we need to get help, get translators so that we can represent clients. A lot of our clients have mental health issues. And so we have to be really cognizant of what it is we're saying, here, Aurelia, you know, would you take this case?
Right. And you're right. I mean, just in the discussions that we've been having, there are myriad of problems, and you know, and it's not getting any easier at all when you represent the minority or underserved population, which actually brings me to, and I do know that LSC actually conducted a pro bono task force, to make recommendations about improving access to justice in the wake of some very disturbing trends. But before we get to the report, John, I'd like to actually ask you, what are the disturbing trends that you see, and maybe a follow-up also with you? Like, I know one of them is obviously, the increasing number of unmet needs, but yet the funding keeps going down.
Well, let me just say, I want to clear up a misconception also probably that's out there. Most of the matters that the grantees that we support work on do not end up in court. So, in fact, I think it's 87% of our matters end up not in court. So this is not, the services that are being provided often are advice, counseling, how to figure out their rights, intersect it with an administrative agency, get something, veterans who come back and don't understand how to get their benefits started. These things don't require a lawsuit. But one of the unintended, I'm sure, consequences of the drop in funding, the spike in demand, is the courts themselves are being flooded with pro se litigants. So people are just showing up. Frequently, these are matters that if a lawyer had been involved, might never have had to come into the courtroom. It could have been resolved outside. But here they are showing up in the courts through all the levels of the courts, all the way up to the courts of appeals, pro se litigants. And this is having enormous impact on the functioning of our courts. Illinois has just started an Illinois Access to Justice Commission to look at this. That's one of the topics on its plate. But when you say across the country, if you have a system in which most Americans who are low income feel that the justice system doesn't work for them, that they can't get access to it, ultimately, I think they lose confidence in not only our justice system, but our government, our form of democracy. Is this, is this fair for me? Should low-income people be deprived of the access to have their grievances ventilated, their issues taken care of, that you and I have just come to expect? And if a growing number of our citizens start to feel that there's no way that they can get a fair shot this way, well, what does that mean? You know, I worry tremendously about that. We know when our justice system works, it's the greatest in the world. We in many respects take it for granted. We can't take it for granted anymore. We need to get to work on this. I'm optimistic because I believe with more and more people like yourselves, Aurora, taking an interest in this and highlighting the issue, that we will educate the bar, and ultimately the bar will turn to the rest of the country and say, hey, because what I've said is, as I've become closer and closer to understanding the gravity of this issue, well, you can't see the cracks in the justice system like you can in a highway. But they're just as big, maybe bigger. I've started to call this more of not a justice gap, but a chasm or a gulf because of how many people are out there. So we need to attend to that. And I think it's a matter of urgency for the future of our country, really.
Well, and I think the other piece of this, and I agree with John about the urgency, is for very poor people, much more of their lives is dependent on government rules, government programs, government notices. So that if they don't understand, or they don't take the right steps, or they miss a deadline, you're talking about food on the table, you're talking about a place to live, you're talking about coverage for basic health needs. And middle-class people and people with money, their lives are not so constantly regulated by and dependent on the government.
Yeah.
They stand a shot at talking to the vendor themselves and getting things straightened out, talking to a friend, getting good advice. But when you're in this, I mean, red tape doesn't begin to describe the environment in which most poor people live. It's not designed to be user-friendly. And often all it takes, I mean, John is quite right, sometimes we solve a problem that's festered for a family for a year just by picking up the phone and saying, you know, these people have submitted the documentation that you've asked for 4 times. Would you please open the drawer and look for it?
Right.
And because it's us and not them, we get a call back and they say, yeah, fine,
Right.
it's taken care of.
So you're correct about that we did impanel a pro bono task force.
Right. I was going to get to that one.
Yeah, and the reason that we did is because our board, coming in 2010, recognizing that there was this growing disparity and that the funding was going down while the need, Diane is right, the perfect storm, we felt, well, and this was about a year ago, as we got into this, that we ought to take a good look at pro bono and how the pro bono efforts around the country were functioning. And so we put together a task force of 60, close to 60, Diana was on it, leaders in the profession, in the legal assistance community as well, judges, corporate lawyers, big firm lawyers, small firm lawyers, rural, urban, tech people, to take a look and say, oh, okay, let's take a fresh look at this and see if we can come up with some ideas, because we're all getting the impression that the mismatch does exist. That is the mismatch of the available talent to the need over here. And what the task force, we broke the task force into 5 working groups. Best practices urban, so we could take a look at what really innovative, interesting, good things are happening from the best urban programs and begin to share that. What about in rural America, where there's a huge, huge issue and the distance is so great and the number of lawyers so small? So then tech, a group on tech, because in Illinois, incidentally, has some wonderful programs using tech that are models for the nation. But how we can better share that and how you can get information to somebody's mobile phone. We also know that low-income folks have smartphones.
Right.
So can we get to, so we had, then what obstacles are there and what big ideas would there be? So with those working groups, we began to take a good hard look at and offer some advice. The group worked really hard and amazingly has come up with this with a report in a year.
Yeah.
And I didn't.
And actually, I wish we had more time,
Yeah.
because I really want to get in depth into, you know, the pro bono
Sure.
task force study. But we are out of time, and maybe what we can do is we can actually do a follow-up on this one. And also, I really want to thank you both, because your work in this department is actually very, very important. It's crucial to make sure that the legal needs of the low-income people are actually taken care of. Diana White and G Levy, thank you for educating us about the importance of access to justice. For more information, visit lsc.gov and lafchicago.org. I'm Aurora Balastriaco. Thank you for watching the Chicago Bar Association's Justice and Law Weekly.
Closed captioning for Justice and Law Weekly is provided in part by the Clifford Law Offices in support of quality public television for the Chicago area.